The snow fell gently on the morning of her wedding as if nature itself were whispering a quiet warning. Pale skies stretched over a kingdom blinking against the bitter wind of January and against the rising tide of anticipation. They had called her beautiful in the papers. They had called her obedient. But no one knew her, not truly. Not the way her mother once had before silence took her. Not the way her governesses had, tightening the strings of posture and piety until she could barely breathe. Not the way the man she was to marry would ever dare to try. She had been born Charlotte Augusta of Wales, and from the very first breath, her heart had not belonged to her. It had been seized by politics and wrapped in velvet, its beat tuned to the rhythms of public expectation. She was the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, the solitary hope for a dynasty tottering under the weight of its own madness. Her father, the Prince Regent, ruled in place of his ailing father, and his hunger for control was as ferocious as the cold that winter. But Charlotte had always bristled under that control. Her spirit was sharp and her tongue sharper. She had once ripped the ribbons from her dress at court, declaring herself no doll. She had been betrothed and unbetrothed with the speed of military alliances, offered as a bride to every strategic partner from Austria to Prussia. Her father paraded her like a chess piece. And she, clever as she was, played her part until she saw an opening to break free. She found him not in a foreign prince but in a relatively obscure German nobleman, Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. He was quiet, serious, modest in manner and mannerisms. To her, that was rebellion. He was not a romantic hero. He was not rich. He was not chosen by the court. And that, too, thrilled her. She told her ladies that she would finally have something of her own. The wedding was arranged, but not with joy. Her father gritted his teeth and forced a smile, suspecting even then that his hold over her was slipping. The day of her wedding, she wore a white gown so heavy with embroidery it left red marks on her shoulders. Her face was powdered to perfection, but her eyes were dark-ringed with exhaustion. Not from fear, but from the weight of finally having her own fate in her hands. At least, that is what she believed. The ceremony was as grand as expected, and she kissed him not out of passion but with a resolute kind of hope. For a different future. For a new kind of queen. They called her radiant. But underneath the veils and pearls, Charlotte felt as though she had been entombed. She had escaped one prison for another. And no one around her understood that she was already mourning something. Not her old life, but the illusion that anything she chose would ever really be hers. That night, as the guests drank and the palace echoed with the clamor of celebration, Charlotte sat in silence beside Leopold. He was kind, gentle, but the hollowness inside her did not move. She had thought that marriage might make her whole. Instead, she felt more vanished than ever. She would soon learn that love, in her world, was not escape. It was obligation sewn in gold thread. In the mirror, she did not see a bride. She saw an heir. And behind her eyes lingered the face of a child who had long ago stopped hoping for rescue. There had been no rescue. Only ceremony. Only sacrifice. Before she had become the queen who never was, Charlotte had been the child who never laughed too loudly. Her nursemaids noted it early, her tendency to watch rather than play, to listen behind doors, to press her fingers against the glass of windows like someone trying to understand where the world ended and she began. Her parents had been a battlefield long before she was born. Her mother, Caroline of Brunswick, was erratic and defiant, with a mouth full of wild German and a taste for scandal. Her father, the Prince Regent, was all vanity and control, a man who believed dignity lay in distance. He loathed Caroline from the moment they met and kept Charlotte far from her, raising her like a monarch, not a daughter. The girl learned early that her cries would not be heard, that affection was something others earned but she must never expect. There was a garden in Windsor where she once played, at least in the early years. She had a pet dog named Muff and a governess who taught her French by candlelight. But by the time she was 10, her life was managed by committee. Every smile, every letter, every lesson recorded and reviewed. Her tutors praised her intelligence but warned of her temper. She was spirited, they said. Difficult, whispered others. Too much like her mother. When Caroline was finally banished from court, Charlotte's questions about her were met with cold redirects. Do not speak her name. Do not look for her. She is gone. And so Charlotte learned to grieve people who were still living. It was a skill she would use again and again. Her father, meanwhile, paraded her at court, calling her his jewel when she pleased him and locking her away when she did not. At 13, she was forced to sit through banquets where diplomats judged her value in whispers. By 16, she was being sized up for marriage like a prized mare. Her body was never her own. Her future hung on treaties inked by men who did not ask her thoughts. In this loneliness, Charlotte developed a stubborn will. She refused to marry the Dutch prince her father selected, bursting into hysterics until the engagement was broken. She was sent to Windsor as punishment, isolated among elderly ladies-in-waiting who read sermons aloud to her over boiled eggs. Her letters were censored. Her walks watched. But she did not bend. Not fully. Not yet. It was then that she met Leopold. He was different from the others. He did not treat her as a prize. He was calm, reserved, and when she tested him with teasing or defiance, he did not flinch. In that stillness, she imagined strength. In his foreignness, she imagined safety. Her love for him was not a fairy tale, it was an act of rebellion cloaked in romance. They courted under the suspicious gaze of a court, exchanging carefully worded letters and stolen glances. When Charlotte finally insisted on the match, her father threatened disinheritance. But she did not budge. It was the one time in her life she had drawn a line and dared her father to cross it. So the wedding was approved. Begrudgingly. Arranged with fanfare and frost. Charlotte emerged the victor of her own heart's campaign, believing she had secured freedom. But she had only traded one prison for another. The rules would still be written by others. Only the walls had changed. In her diary, she wrote that she finally felt seen. That she would no longer be treated like a political pawn. And yet, even as she wrote those words, her hand trembled. As though some part of her already knew, deep down, that the price of love in her world was not freedom. It was sacrifice. The kind that took everything and gave nothing back. The first few months of marriage unfolded like the quiet breath before a storm. Charlotte and Leopold retreated from the frenzy of court life to a modest residence at Claremont House, where they wandered the gardens hand in hand, whispered in German over breakfast, and wrote letters full of cautious optimism. The public adored their simplicity. It was said that Charlotte was finally happy. But happiness, in her world, was as fragile as porcelain. Charlotte became pregnant within the first year of marriage. The news was met with national celebration. Church bells rang. Streets filled with cheers. England, long starved of legitimate heirs and weary of its scandal-ridden royals, looked to her swollen belly as a kind of salvation. Finally, they thought. A queen in waiting, a child to unite the fractured house. Charlotte herself seemed transformed, softer, more inward. Her usual wit grew quieter, edged with uncertainty. She read books on motherhood. She embroidered tiny shirts. But her body, long untested and weakened by emotional strain, began to betray her. She suffered from bouts of vomiting, sudden fainting spells, and an unshakable sense of dread she could not voice aloud. Physicians dismissed it. They prescribed rest, water, walks. They told her the child would be strong. They always said that. But the deeper truth was that Charlotte had been failing long before the pregnancy. The girl who had once burned with spirit now drifted through rooms like a ghost, her fire dimmed to coals. She loved Leopold. That much was true. But love had not set her free. It had only given her something more to lose. The autumn air grew sharp as her due date approached. By November, she had been in confinement for weeks, a custom meant to shield royal mothers from stress and scandal. Instead, it isolated her. She missed her garden. She missed the air. Her letters became shorter, more clipped. Her handwriting slanted, rushed, as if something inside her was pushing to escape. And then the labor began. It started on the evening of November 5th. Gentle at first. Manageable. But hours passed. Then a day. Then another. 50 hours of labor. No relief. The baby was large and slow to descend. The physicians, led by Sir Richard Croft, refused to intervene surgically. Bleeding her. Watching. Waiting. The screams were muffled behind heavy doors, but Leopold heard them. And Charlotte heard the silence in return. When the baby boy was finally born, he was still. No breath. No cry. No life. They placed him beside her, his face too perfect, too quiet. She stared at him for hours. No tears. No fury. Just stillness. They buried him that same night in secret. No christening. No name. Only a small coffin and a mourning gown no one had prepared. Charlotte seemed to recover at first. Her voice returned. She asked for food. She smiled at Leopold. But it was only the echo of a recovery. In truth, her body had begun to collapse. The blood returned suddenly. Violently. She became cold. Her breathing shallowed. Croft, unsure and overwhelmed, tried nothing. And soon there was nothing to try. At 2:30 in the morning on November 6th, Charlotte Augusta of Wales died. 21 years old. Gone. The nation awoke to silence. And then horror. Shopkeepers wept. Sailors lowered their flags. Women wore black for weeks. The future of the monarchy vanished in a single night, and with it, the illusion that goodness guaranteed survival. But behind the grief, there was another emotion. Guilt. Because Charlotte had been paraded. Possessed. Used. And when she died, the world did not just mourn her death. It mourned what it had done to her. The tragedy of Charlotte's death did not remain confined to mourning cloth and newspaper columns. It carved the wound into the monarchy that festered in silence, rewrote alliances, and cracked open the thin veneer of royal stability. She had been the golden thread holding together a tapestry already fraying at the edges. And now, that thread had snapped. The public, who had once devoured every sketch of her dresses and every quote from her tutors, turned their grief into outrage. They demanded to know why she had died. Why no one had acted. Why the physician stood idle as her strength ebbed away like light under a closing door. But the court gave no answers. Sir Richard Croft, racked with guilt and hounded by whispers, sank into a quiet madness. Just 3 months later, while attending another difficult labor, he took a pistol and shot himself in the head. He died instantly. The child and mother he was tending to both survived. They called it the triple obstetric tragedy: Charlotte, her child, and Croft. 3 deaths from one birth. A cruel arithmetic. And yet amid all this grief, something even darker brewed. Charlotte had not merely been beloved. She had been useful. Her presence allowed the Prince Regent to claim a kind of legitimacy he otherwise lacked. Now, with his daughter gone, the royal family was thrown into a desperate scramble. One by one, Charlotte's bachelor uncles, aging, indulgent, indifferent, were now ordered to marry and produce heirs. The monarchy had no choice but to engineer a future from desperation. It was a strange irony that her death gave birth to Queen Victoria. Her uncle Edward, Duke of Kent, had rushed to Mary after Charlotte's funeral. His child, Victoria, would become the monarch history remembered. But history did not remember what had been lost to make way for her. Leopold remained at Claremont House, pacing empty halls once filled with laughter and newlywed promises. He kept Charlotte's dresses in her wardrobe. He preserved the small items, her gloves, her hairbrush, her last unopened letter. Visitors said he never fully smiled again. He refused to remarry for years. And when he finally did, it was to another European princess, cold, calculated. Nothing like the stormy, sharp-witted girl who had once challenged a nation with nothing more than her refusal to obey. He named his first daughter Charlotte. There is something cruel in the quiet that followed her death. For all her defiance, for all her efforts to seize life in her own hands, Charlotte had died in the most traditional of ways, submissive to the advice of men, locked away from the world, a vessel for a future that never arrived. Her funeral was massive. The bells rang for hours. But her life ended as so many royal lives did. Alone. Powerless. Reduced to symbolism. Even her memory became a tool. A myth. Charlotte the tragic. Charlotte the pure. Charlotte the lost promise of a nation. They forgot her temper. Her fierce intelligence. The letters she burned. The men she refused. The strength it took to choose love over strategy. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy. For Charlotte was not a perfect heroine. She had been difficult. Unyielding. Too much like her mother, some whispered. But she had been real. And in her death, she was smoothed and silenced, turned into a beautiful ghost rather than a woman who might have ruled. Because make no mistake, had she lived, she would have ruled. Not as a puppet queen, not as a passive figurehead, but as a sovereign who had clawed her way to the crown with bare hands and sharper will. And perhaps that frightened them most of all. Years passed. England changed. Monarchs came and went. Victoria's reign smoothed the chaos that Charlotte's death had unleashed, and with each generation, the memory of the queen who never was slipped further from the public tongue. A name on a marble slab. A footnote in a royal family tree. But behind the silence, something stubborn remained. Charlotte haunted the palace. Not as a ghost in white or a whisper in the corridors, but as a presence. A question. What if? What if she had lived? What if she had worn the crown? What if she had borne not a stillborn child, but a line of monarchs shaped in her image? The world would have been different. Because Charlotte had been something the monarchy rarely allowed, her soul divided between duty and rebellion. She had been born into expectation and resisted it until her final days. Her mother, exiled and mocked. Her father, bloated with self-regard. Her husband, well-meaning but ultimately powerless. And she, caught between them all, tried to forge a self from the shards they left behind. And still, the question lingers. What would have happened if her child had lived? If the physicians had intervened? If the bleeding had been stopped? Would she have changed the monarchy? Would she have rewritten its rules? Or would it have broken her, slowly, as it did so many others? There are diaries, fragments, scraps of Charlotte's handwriting that historians still pore over. In one, dated just weeks before her death, she wrote, "I know they watch me. I know what they want. But I am not afraid. I will not vanish. I will not be like her. It is unclear whether she meant her mother or someone else. Perhaps she meant herself, an older, imagined version who would be caged by her own survival. In the end, that was the most unsettling truth. Charlotte was not simply a victim. She was a threat. A woman too passionate to be contained, too intelligent to be used, too royal to be dismissed. Her death was not just a tragedy. It was a relief to those who feared her potential. And so they made her into something soft, something mourned, something quiet. But she was never quiet. She was thunder in a gown. She was the child who refused her father. The bride who chose her own groom. The princess who screamed during labor and was answered only by silence. Her wedding had been white, but her funeral followed so quickly that it might as well have been the same ceremony. Flowers were still fresh. Gowns still stitched. She died as she lived, surrounded by ceremony but never protected by it. And as England wept, no one asked the one question that should have haunted them most. What if she had lived? What would she have become? How much worse, or how much greater, might it have been? Would she have saved the monarchy or unmade it? Would she have loved her child? Or would the crown have turned her into something her mother had always feared? A sovereign far colder than the man who made her. We mourned her too early. And we mourned her wrong. Because Charlotte Augusta of Wales was not the queen who never was. She was the queen who almost was. And that, more than anything, is what should keep us up at night.